Hi there, and thank you for joining me for today's live reading of Twisted Oath by A.S. Roberts, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue, Serafina, present day. Today's the day, Sarah. I heard Nick's voice just as his warm breath traveled over my ear. At the same time, his hand brushed delicately across my upper arm as my eyelids reluctantly fluttered open. Finding the July sunshine already forcing its way either side of the cream Roman blinds, I squeezed them shut once again. Today's the day. I couldn't have put it more aptly if I'd have tried. Not only had our time together come to an end, but a hope I had carried around with me also had an expiration date of today. Furthermore, this date carried with it the greatest loss I'd ever known. I wasn't sure I was strong enough to deal with everything this beautiful sunny day in July would bring, but equally knew I had to. Up until this point, I had always known the next step to take in my life, but I had no idea where I was going next, and I hated the feeling of being rudderless. I had no definite plan. There were two things I wanted in my life, but deep down I'd always known I wouldn't be able to have both. Having made no reaction to his words or touch, my bed then dipped, and I knew within seconds I would hear Nick's bare feet connecting with the Georgian oak floorboards as he moved away from me and across the room. My lack of response had been enough for him to understand that I wasn't going to change my mind, and I wouldn't be going with him. He needed the chance to accept his path in life, and I had to stay to work out mine. I knew that I was going to miss him. Nick and I had become friends in the first year of university. Although we'd never delved into each other's pasts, we seemed to wordlessly understand that the baggage we'd brought between us was piled high, far too high to wade through. Then, about 6 months ago, we'd become even closer after recognizing that we'd helped each other to overcome the obstacles that had been thrown into our paths during the first few years of university life. Spending the night together had become a regular part of our week. The fact that Nick lived in the rented flat above mine was a bonus, meaning we could always be there for each other when needed, and we weren't party to other people's judgment or their opinion on our relationship. Equally, I knew that if today marked the end of my time in London, I would also miss the beautiful home I'd created for myself. My flat had been brought back from the dead by my own hands, being only the second thing I'd ever created. Having nothing else to concentrate on, nothing else to numb the hurt and pain I carried inside myself, I'd poured my unrequited love and passion into the nearly derelict flat. Painstakingly, I'd brought my one-bedroomed home back to life, keeping the original features where I could. When it was finally completed, I'd moved into Montague Place and had been here ever since, living out the only dream I still held. But today the bell tolled. Graduation day marked the end of my time at university and the last day that he would know where to find me. A feeling of melancholy washed over me as I contemplated the loss of another two things from my life. Nick was off to the US to continue his education and work experience in his chosen field of surgery, and I was going to take the only path I could see in front of me to put my medical training to good use and apply for a role as a junior doctor in a busy London hospital. But whether that would happen remained to be seen. I had a secret. I've been living a double life. A double life that half the time scared me to death, yet the other half fueled the very blood that kept my passionate heart beating. I had made a good life for myself over the past few years. I'd enjoyed everything that came with being at university. I'd forged friendships, at times hadn't slept for 36 hours straight while I swatted for an exam with my small group of friends. I'd attended lectures and seminars operating on Red Bull alone. But for all the things I'd experienced and shared with others, I hadn't shared who I really was with anyone at University College London, not even Nick. Because it was easier for me to live with who I was when I was the only one aware of my reality. Or maybe I hadn't said the words out loud because I knew that however intelligent I wasn't articulate enough to explain it in the 21st century. Although I'd been born in London and embraced my London life, a part of my soul belonged to an area in southern Italy, a place where family, honor, and tradition hadn't changed for centuries. The very second I'd placed my pen down on top of my paper and acknowledged that my final exams had been sat, a sense of knowing my time was up had crept up on me, and it had grown even ever larger as each day of the past 2 months had gone by. Just because I hadn't admitted it out loud to anyone in the past few years, that didn't mean my other life had ceased to exist. I knew that it was only a matter of time before it loomed over me. He promised me he'd come back, he'd be back for me. Only time would tell. Destiny, as he called it, had all of one day left. Maybe he's not coming at all? Trying to extinguish the pain that thought brought with it each and every time I had allowed it headspace, I shook my head and tried to relieve it of my jumbled thoughts. First things first. Trying to appear more relaxed than I felt, I stretched out my limbs, rolled onto my back, and let my eyes drift across the room. I took in the sight of Nick getting dressed for what I realized would be the very last time. He pulled on last night's t-shirt, and as his head appeared back through the neck, I offered him the most brilliant smile I could and hoped it conveyed my silent thanks. Thanks for being you. Thanks for caring. Thanks for understanding. Thanks, I couldn't have done it without you. Just thanks. As the smile began to fade on my lips, along with the time we'd spent together being more than just a steady support for each other, he exhaled as he grabbed at his hair and forced the much longer top lengths of his dirty blonde strands up into a hair tie. Then his eyes found mine. Sarah, the reluctance I'd been hearing creeping further and further into his voice over the past few days sounded out loud and clear as he said my name. I gathered the top sheet around me as I sat up, and after flipping my long, dark hair to the right side of my face, I held out my hand to him. After walking the few steps back to reach me, Nick took hold of my proffered hand and sat down heavily next to me on the bed. He turned my hand over and gently placed his mouth to the back of it. You need to go, Nick. We've both got a busy day ahead of us. It doesn't have to be this way, Sarah. I inhaled quickly as I tried to muster up what I knew I needed to say next. In another life, maybe not, but come on. I started to shake my head at him a little. We always knew that this day would mark the end of this chapter of our lives. You're off to America, and me, well, you knew I wouldn't be going with you. What if I told you I loved you? I pulled my hand from his hold and placed my forefinger over his lips, effectively shushing him before he said any more. But you wouldn't say that, would you, Nick? I interrupted him swiftly. This isn't love. This has been the very best friendship, but it's not love. Deep down inside, you know that. We're a comfortable fit, a safe place for each other, but we're not in love, Nick. I gently chastised. This was never going to be long-term between us. There was no way there would ever be a future in us. We were always going to be just this, in the here and now. And when the time came, we knew this chapter would close. My voice sounded out strongly, more strongly than I was feeling inside, and selfishly, I hoped he would help me make the final goodbye a little easier. His forehead furrowed before he dropped his head, making my hand fall away, and then, as my words filtered through, he lifted it back up again. I wish I could change your mind. It won't happen, I implored. You're going to make the best life in America, Nick, one where people accept you for you. We'll look back on this in a few years' time and see it for what it really is. We've been each other's crutch, and I know someone special is out there waiting for you, Nick. It's now time for you to go and find them. A thick air of silence fell around us. Nick nodded, slowly at first and then more resolutely at me. Just know this, Serafina Giordano. When they call out your name today, I'll be the one cheering the loudest. As I will for you, I spoke once again as he stood up and prepared to leave, then he disappeared from my view. I refused to say goodbye, so I'll be seeing you. Nick called out, and without waiting for my reply, he shut the door to my flat with a heavy, resounding thud and ended our time together with a semicolon, which I knew had to be a very loud full stop. I focused on him only until I heard his feet connect with the squeaky floorboard above. Then I fell back onto the pillows behind me, closed my eyes, and in my head, I went back to our beach. You look so hot, Mia's voice echoed around my large bedroom. I wish I could be there for you today. Thank you, I replied before bending my knees a little in a pretend curtsy. I wish you could too, I answered, but your work experience must come first, and I know Gabriel will be demanding that you spend any free time with him. I carried on applying my makeup without looking at my laptop and the beautiful face of my sister, who had just completed her first couple of terms at her chosen university in Rome. I could see in my mind's eye the heat my words would have put in her cheeks. Still, Mia moaned. Stop, will you? Mom and Papa will be there. That's all I need. Even I heard the lie in my voice. How is Gabriel? I changed the subject deliberately to Mia's favorite one. Oh, you know, she sighed. I looked over at her quickly, unable to deny myself the look of sheer happiness that I knew would have consumed her as we spoke about her childhood sweetheart. I know you too, yes. Give him my love. I will. The doorbell sounding caused my heart to jolt up into my throat. So much for meeting me there. I cast my eyes up to the large face of the clock that dominated one of the walls of my bedroom and checked the time. And you're early, I grumbled into the bright sunshine filled room, refusing to move until I was ready. I stretched my face into position to receive the final lick of black mascara from the wand I was holding. Looks like they've decided to meet me here. I'll FaceTime you later. I looked back at Mia. Okay. I saw her brow furrow at me in question, and then as she threw a look over her shoulder in silent question, I understood that Gabriel was in the room with her. When her question wasn't answered, she turned back to face the screen. You know, I only spoke to Mom about an hour ago. She said nothing about changing their plans today. In fact, she said she was looking forward to seeing you for the first time as you walk into the Royal Festival Hall as part of the graduation procession. Mia's face looked thoughtful as her mind ran into overdrive, and I knew by the way my heart was beating strongly in my chest that my face was mirroring hers. Oh, you know them. They always change their minds last minute. I shrugged at her, trying to take us back to just a few seconds before, hopefully conveying that I hadn't a care in the world. When the skin on my cheeks started burning, I understood that I wasn't going to be able to disguise my apprehension, and even more disturbingly, my excitement for very much longer. Must go. Ciao, Bella. I blew her a quick kiss, and closed my laptop. I screwed the mascara wand down, and after standing back to check my reflection in the long mirror, I confirmed that my black robe was hanging correctly over the turquoise shot silk, knee-length, Bardot-style fitted dress that I'd chosen for today. Then I smoothed the dress down over my thighs and flicked my hands through my long hair, which I'd worn loose especially for today. My thick mane of hair would never have allowed for a mortar board to be attached otherwise. Expelling a loud sigh as I tried to calm down the nerves that were threatening to engulf me, I slipped my feet into the matching 3-inch heels, putting on my missing jewelry, and retrieved my clutch bag from the end of my bed, before scurrying to my front room and looking down onto the road through the wooden shuttered bay window. When I couldn't find my parents' car in the place my papa's driver always parked, my heartbeat ramped up a notch. As I stared harder up the short road, I realized that it wasn't anywhere to be found because we hadn't arranged to meet here in the first place. The doorbell rang again, sounding out its operator's impatience, and I looked into the street in the other direction, hoping to find my papa's silver Bentley. Instead, my eyes found an expensive-looking black car sitting in the middle of the road and blocking what was fortunately one of the quieter streets of London. Craning my neck a little after refusing to put my fingertips onto the wood in front of me in case I was seen, I caught sight of a large man dressed in what was without a doubt a handmade navy blue Italian suit. He jogged down the stone steps that led up to my front door until his feet found the pavement and my heart momentarily stopped beating. I forced my gaze back to the man as he turned around to look once again at the door. Then, as if he knew exactly where to find me standing behind the deliberately angled white shutters, he leant back against his shiny car, crossed his arms over the front of his perfectly ironed white shirt and open suit jacket, and stared straight into my window. As if I needed any confirmation of what I already knew, my gaze went straight to his tattoo-covered hands with a large, blood-red garnet of his family's ring in his right hand, the titanium wedding band on his left, and as if he instinctively were to look, the eyes of my husband found my own. When my heart restarted after I'd let out a loud gasp and dropped my clutch to the floor, it started with a completely different rhythm. Instantly, my body felt as if I was out jogging on a cold, crisp morning, struggling to draw in enough oxygen. In those few seconds, I understood that although it may have been 5 years since I'd last set eyes on him, nothing had changed between us. I was standing behind the bricks and mortar of a house that had stood for 2 centuries, withstood the blitz of the Second World War, but I might as well have been stripped naked in front of him. The connection between us hadn't been extinguished, despite my many prayers over the years. The boy I'd dreamt about, the young man I'd loved, who had grown into a man I both loved and hated with an intense passion, still held me firmly in his grasp. There will always be an us, Serafina. The words he'd said to me on our parting came back at me now, and my body trembled with the intensity they still held. I wanted to run, but instead I dipped my head in resignation. The longer I took to go out to him, the more power he'd think he had over me. I didn't want to give him any further insights into my thoughts or the way I felt than was necessary. Moving quickly, I ducked down to retrieve my clutch and took a few moments to compose myself. When I stood up again, I made myself stand as tall as my 5'3" height would allow and walked with determination to the door. Pulling it open sharply, I rapidly matched his scrutiny with my own. I offered him no greeting and no smile of encouragement, just an acceptance of the inevitable. With his eyes raking over me as he took all of me in, I deliberately took each step down to my fate with calculated caution, using muscle memory alone. I knew I could give no quarter, so I looked intently back at him as I continued, until finally I was stood directly in front of him with barely a centimeter between our bodies. Summoning every ounce of courage I knew I had in me, I slowly lifted my chin up, following the path of his 6'7" frame. My eyes traveled up his tie, which I hadn't noticed until then, and saw that it was made of the exact same material as my designer dress. Rather than make comment, I chose to accept it without expressing surprise in any words or hopefully showing it on my face. Because deep down, it was no surprise. I may not have caught sight of him over the past few years, but I had thought I'd felt him nearby, and although I had surmised that I must be dreaming, I'd occasionally thought I'd smelt his signature cologne. And I'd have been a fool to believe he hadn't been periodically keeping tabs on me, and I was nobody's fool, at least not anymore. I didn't see his arm lift in my peripheral vision, so as his forefinger and thumb connected with my chin to lift my gaze to his more quickly than I had intended, I inadvertently jumped, feeling as though my skin had been singed on our very first contact. As his other muscular arm wrapped possessively around me, pulling me into him and closing the gap between us, I expelled all the air in my lungs and breathed in the warm air that had just left my body. Hints of citrus consumed my senses. With the most dangerous man I'd ever known holding me tightly and with his large frame looming over me, I looked up. Our eyes connected, and such was the power between our union, I had to fight not to pull away. The second I saw the telltale crinkles form in the corner of his eyes, I knew he'd read my badly concealed emotions, and I vowed there and then to get better at hiding my feelings. His hand moved away from my chin, and he trailed his knuckles roughly down my neck until his thumb pushed into the hollow at the base of my throat. Hello, little bird. I kept my promise. You got your dream. I swept my tongue over my bottom lip, tasting the minty breath he'd just expelled. It's time for you to come home. Destiny had indeed come calling. Part 1. Chapter 1. Salvatore, 14 years old. The warmth of the early morning sunrise stirred me from an uncomfortable and fitful couple hours of dozing. I stretched out my long limbs to relieve their ache and looked out to sea to watch the sunrise over the horizon and, for a few seconds, lost myself as I appreciated the beauty of my country of birth. As the fingers of sunlight traveled further up my body, holding me captive, I was reminded of what I was here for. I stilled and strained my ears to hear if the Giordano villa was rousing. It wasn't long before I heard the telltale noise of the maid sweeping the extensive patio, which would soon be followed by the pool cleaner doing his jobs. 10 minutes later, the family would come outside to sit and eat breakfast together. I knew this because it was my third early morning sitting amongst the rocks that covered the coastline. Not long to wait, Sal, I whispered. Sitting up, I rubbed at my eyes to clear my vision, and with my stomach growling, I looked down gratefully to the leather satchel I dropped beside me in the moonlit darkness. I was pleased I'd curbed my impatience to get here and had stopped to grab some food on the way out. At already 6'2" and still growing, I was always hungry. So I'd shoved some food and bottle of water in the satchel before I jumped out of my bedroom window and kicked my bike into life. As I tipped out the contents onto the flat stone I'd been using as a plate for the previous couple of days, I thought back to a few days before. Watching in the shadows from across the street, I'd seen as he arrived at the sanctuary of Our Lady of Pulsey with his family. They'd looked picture perfect as they stopped to speak to the priest and a few of the monks, and my anger had grown as I studied them all and registered that he had everything, while his actions had left me with nothing. Him in his expensive Italian suit, looking every bit the head of his family. Walking alongside him was his beautiful English wife carrying a baby girl in her arms. I knew enough about Rosemary Giordano, Her family, the Thomases, were the London's East End royalty, gangsters who had once worked alongside the Crays. Oh, yeah, without a doubt, he had all the right connections in the UK to enable him to run his business and become more successful than he deserved. Even after giving birth to the 5 Giordano bastards, she still looked good enough to fuck. I'd made the sign of the cross over my chest as I'd prayed to Our Lady that her cunt was stretched and that sinking his cock into her now felt like fucking a bucket of grease. I'd continued to watch them as Our Lady was paraded through San Luca. As they'd smiled and joined in with the throwing of grain and flowers into Our Lady's path, he'd given himself away when he'd looked for his eldest daughter and taken hold of her hand. At first, I couldn't work out if he was taking hold of her hand because he wanted her there beside him or if he was making sure she remained precisely where she should be. Standing there, concealed by the exultation and rapture all around me, I could hardly contain my excitement when I understood it was both things. Giordano had shown me his feelings for his daughter, and my plan had formulated. Finally, I'd understood how I was going to enact my revenge. I felt a grin spread across my face at the memory. Then suddenly, after needing to do something with the infusion of adrenaline my thoughts had triggered, I sat up and pulled a jewel-handled knife from the back of my heavy bike boots. Leaning back onto one elbow, I took a bite from a large tomato and started to slice the bread and cheese while I waited right under Alessandro Giordano's nose, but out of his sight and control. It didn't take long for my patience to be rewarded. The daughter they called Serafina, the one I'd already worked out, felt more comfortable being on the edge of her sizable family. Found her way to the gate that had led down from the terrace to the sea, just like she had the previous 2 days. After being granted permission and given her promise to stay well away from the water, she flew down the path to find her sanctuary directly beneath where I was hiding, just as the swift I'd been feeding for my breakfast swooped down to peck at the crumbs I'd purposefully left on the stone. My eyes went from the swift to the girl. Taking flight again, little bird? I aimed the whispered question at the small brown-haired girl as she walked on the rocks at the base of the cliff. One day, when the time was right, I'd steal her right from under his nose. But not yet. She was still a child, and although I hadn't been granted the innocence of childhood, I still believed that children should be left to grow and live in peace. But when she was older, well, then she'd be prime for picking. Adults were fair game. I allowed my eyes to feast on her childish enjoyment at being allowed to escape her normal confines and smiled as I heard her laughter travel up to me on the already warm breeze. Her laughter encouraged a warm, unrecognizable feeling in my gut to unravel, and, in turn, a smile spread over my face as I watched her. No, I wasn't ready to destroy her just yet. My watch vibrated on my wrist, letting me know that my Giordano soldiers were about to change shift, and for now, my time was up. Snatching up my knife, I placed it back into the sheath inside the back of my boot, grabbed at my satchel, and moved back towards my bike. Deliberately, I kicked some of the loose rock and stood tall just as the rubble attracted Serafina's attention. With my satchel over my shoulder, I ran both of my hands through my hair and stared at her. With her turquoise eyes staring back at me, I turned and moved away. At last, I reached where I ditched my bike earlier, safe in the knowledge I was no longer on Giordano's land when I kicked it into life and sped away.